All right, I think it's time for us to begin this afternoon webinar on the quest in Europe for technology sovereignty and what lessons that have been learned from the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Fredrik Eriksson. I am one of the directors of the European Center for International Political Economy, and I'm also going to be the host and moderator for the webinar we're going to have this afternoon. You are all probably experts by now on Zoom and etiquette on Zoom, which is that most of us that are panelists are going to be muted during the round of introductory remarks. We're going to hear from 3 speakers, and after that, we will have opportunities for people to come in and join the conversation. So the 2 different ways that you can do that is either you raise a question in the chat, and that means you can ask the questions anonymously, which means that I'm going to read up the question from you to the panel, or you can raise your hand and use that function, which means that I am going to make sure that you get the opportunity to ask your questions or make your point directly. So feel free to do that during the course of the introductory remarks or after the conversation. And we hope to be able to bring in a good number of people who also want to participate directly with the panel. All right, so let me first start to welcome all the people that have joined this webinar, and a particular welcome to the panelists and the people that are going to speak and to kick us off on this conversation. We're going to start by listening to a presentation by my colleague Matthias Bauer, who is going to walk us through a new study that we at ECIPE has released, which is on technology sovereignty and the broader discussion we've had for some months now in Europe about whether there should be special actions taken in order to promote technology sovereignty. So far, I think it's fair to say that no one really knows what technology sovereignty actually means, what it constitutes, and hopefully that's part of the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. After that, I'm going to welcome Dita Charanotsova, whom I'm very glad that she is joining us for this seminar. She is both the vice president and she is the vice president of the European Parliament, but that also means that she is a member of the European Parliament. And in that parliament, she does many different things, but one is to sit in the Internal Market Committee. We're also going to be joined in a few minutes by Axel Voss, who is also a member of the European Parliament. Like Dita, Axel is also an outspoken person who has had a strong voice on matters related to technology and Europe's policy on technology. So that's the lineup for this afternoon. So without much further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Matthias, who's going to lead us off, and he is also going to share a PowerPoint presentation with us. Over to you, Matthias.
Yeah, thanks, Fredrik. Thanks for this kind introduction. Let me just put my presentation on the screen so that all of you can see it. I think it should work now. Does it work?
Yes, it works.
Very well. So, yeah, thanks for this kind of introduction. Again, I'm glad that we have so many people who are joining us today at this webinar from different countries, different jurisdictions, not only Belgium or Brussels, but also other countries in the world, our different time zones, a whole bunch of different organizations, including, of course, the European institutions, the Parliament and the Commission, but also the WTO, local business associations, officials from local ministries. And I think this is a huge opportunity that modern communication technologies like the one of Zoom, but also others, give us, because we can reach out to, let's say, a less process-centric audience to inform the debate in other jurisdictions in the EU and elsewhere, which may hopefully feed back to the European debate and inform the debate and the policy analysis, respectively. I will now immediately dive into the subject with a presentation of a new paper that Frederick and me released yesterday. It's a publication about Europe's quest for technology sovereignty, opportunity, and pitfalls. So why did we do this study? We realized that there is an increasing number of policymakers and politicians using terms like technology sovereignty or digital sovereignty in the policy debate about regulatory approaches to certain technologies or business models in the EU. At the same time, there's a lack of consensus, and as Frederick rightfully indicated, many people do not really know what technology sovereignty is actually about. The concept is now increasingly being institutionalized. We see these terms popping up in speeches. We see these terms popping up in official publications by the European Commission, but also party manifestos. Ursula von der Leyen, for example, referred to technological sovereignty in October 2019 in her agenda for Europe, where she argued that it is not too late to achieve technological sovereignty in some critical technology areas. And we will jointly define the standards for this new generation of technologies that will become the global norm, right? This is a very ambitious statement. This way of thinking is also reflected in the economic policy mandate Ursula von der Leyen sent to her commissioners, Thierry Breton, for example, Phil Hogan, but also Margaret Vestager. Margaret Vestager, for example, is mandated to develop an EU's industrial strategy that explicitly contributes to technological sovereignty. But we also see different notions coming from the European Union's member states, with France taking a very prominent role for the last 5 years. French politicians, but also representatives of French civil society organizations have been coining different notions of sovereignty, European sovereignty, industrial sovereignty, and now technology sovereignty. There is a joint statement, for example, by France Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire and Thierry Breton, the Commissioner for the Internal Market. And they are arguing that on digital sovereignty, you know, this is one of the projects that the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, defends with great determination, and that we want to implement here. Now, we see policymakers calling for technology sovereignty, digital sovereignty. We see documents using different notions of sovereignty. And a common denominator, perhaps not a very widely shared perception, but a common denominator in these speeches and communications is the perception that there is a loss of sovereignty when government does not control the evolution of digital technologies and companies. At the same time, we see a considerable lack of consensus with regard to whether technology or digital sovereignty is actually the best way to ensure a stronger digital Europe. Now, when we talk about sovereignty in politics, a lot of talk is, of course, about political sovereignty, and now there is an increasing debate about technological sovereignty. Speaking of political sovereignty, this term was historically used to describe some supreme authority within a certain territory or independence from external political entities. And when we look at law, international law, national law, sovereignty is actually enshrined as the right of people to freely choose their own form of government. But it's different when we talk about technology sovereignty. In recent years, I would say in the past 5 years, when a debate emerged about digital and technology sovereignty, the term was increasingly used to describe various forms of control or autonomy over technologies, digital business models, or digitally provided content. And there was a lot of talk about the need for independence from foreign technology and digital services providers. And a more positive tone emerged in the course of the COVID-19 crisis, when policymakers, but also business representatives, increasingly put it in the context of ensuring reliability of technology access in times of crisis. What I consider important is that irrespective of the domain sovereignty refers to, is political sovereignty, national sovereignty, technology sovereignty, industrial sovereignty, and so on and so forth, these terms are often very ambiguously formulated with respect to individual sovereignty, sovereignty at the individual or person level, or collective sovereignty at the government level or EU level. So the key question here remains, who is actually meant to be empowered by a certain policy? Is it the individual or the state, or is it certain individuals working for the government? Now, referring to sovereignty becomes problematic if policymakers suggest to become truly independent from others. And that means, in the current debate, becoming dependent from our companies, becoming independent from our governments. And in interstate relations, we, of course, observe that in the past, governments cooperated and actually contracted with other governments about the rules in interstate relations, for example, in trade policy making, investment policy making, but also in competition policy. The EU is a good example in itself. And within the scope of these contractual arrangements, governments usually accept certain limits on national sovereignty because alternative forms to govern intergovernmental relations might come with negative consequences. And the EU is actually a good example for shared sovereignty, and from my point of view, a bit paradoxical to stress the need for European technology sovereignty. You might also remember Jean-Claude Juncker's famous speech from 2018 on Europe's moment of sovereignty, where he argued that European sovereignty is born of member states' national sovereignty and does not replace it. And indeed, when we look at the global shifts in economic gravity, cooperation with others perhaps becomes more important than ever before. When we look at the economic fundamentals, we realize that by 2015, both the EU and the US will steadily lose ground to rising economies, such as India and China. If you take the numbers, the EU 27 share in global GDP is going down from now 20% to some 9%. US GDP is expected to stand at 12% of world GDP in 2050. And we see that rising powers like China and also India may indeed gain tremendously in market clout, in economic clout, and they will probably use this clout to increase political pressures on others to conform to their laws. But none of them will actually come close to the same dominance in global rulemaking that the US and the EU, European countries, had in the period that followed the Second World War. So the reality of 2030, 40, and 50, in this reality, global economic power will rather be much more distributed. And in a new situation like this, no single economy can actually set a global standard alone. This would be a new multipolar world with different forces, more equally distributed political forces at work. And neither Europe nor the US will be able to rely on their own market size as the main source of maintaining influence in the global economy, for example, by urging others to adopt a certain set of rules in exchange for market access within the scope of free trade agreements. And in a new situation like this, European policymakers need to improve the capacity to influence global rules and also economic performance by being home to innovative and internationally competitive companies. Or in other words, when quantity does not count in the EU's favor anymore, European policymakers have to improve their regulatory skills at home to encourage innovation and become an example that others want to follow. Now, unfortunately, the track record of European regulators with respect to encouraging regulation within Europe is not particularly strong when we think about the performance of European companies in developing and marketing new digital technologies. On this slide, you see a chart that is based on numbers from a joint OECD Joint Research Committee report, and it is basically telling us that the top research-intensive companies in all of these sectors displayed on this chart do not sit or are not headquartered in European Union member states. There are some of them, but the top research-intensive companies in these sectors, they are currently headquartered in the United States and China. At the same time, I should say that there are still many very knowledge-intensive and successful patent-intensive companies in the EU, not only in these sectors, in ICT-related sectors, but also in other sectors of the economy. And we highlight this in our paper. So please refer to the paper to get more information on where the EU actually stands in terms of innovation. But it is these companies, the most research-intensive companies, that obviously impact on the speed, scale, and scope of global digital transformation, including digital transformation in the EU. At the same time, in the political debate, Europe's successful tech businesses are somewhat overlooked. I would put it like that. Thierry Breton recently highlighted this in an interview where he said, here are some fake news. They say, probably referring to other politicians, they say that Europe is falling behind, and he says that is basically not true. We have everything that is needed in Europe. And indeed, if you look at the numbers from the European Commission, there are already more than 7,000 EU digital platform businesses. Some are very large, some are medium-sized, and others are still relatively small. And there are, at the same time, many startups that are very promising with regards to the business models they invented and intend to scale. In the paper, we outline different strands of narratives underlying the debate about European technology sovereignty, and we think that these strands are important to consider to have a more informed debate. One is what we call culture. It is basically that the belief that Europe is to a large extent different from other parts in the world in regard to defending of the defense of European values and European approaches to regulating markets. Another strand is control. Basically the perception that there is a need for European policy instruments to control the outcomes of the digital economy, or to control how citizens and companies use digital technologies and digital business models. Another strand is competitiveness, basically concerns, political concerns over the capacity of European multinational corporations to compete in world markets, but also fears about the declining role of EU institutions and member state governments regarding the influence in global standard setting procedures. And the fourth strand is cybersecurity, and this is basically about the need for European policies to protect personal and also business data. Now, these ambitions are generally good. But at the same time, these ambitions are not exclusively European. When we read the European Union's recent policy, communications about industrial policy, strategy, Europe's digital future, the strategy on data and artificial intelligence, we realize that there's a lot of talk about European values, and these values are used to guide large packages of new regulations on data, artificial intelligence, and industrial policy initiatives. At the same time, if you look at policy endeavors from other jurisdictions, the US, but also OECD countries, you realize that these ambitions are not so different from our countries in their end goals. And if our countries regulate their digital economies in different ways than Europe, it does not necessarily or automatically mean that their values are so fundamentally different. Another point is that using European values always comes at the risk of emphasizing a common set of values that is actually not shared across Europe, and this might end up with a lack of consensus and an undermination of the economic freedoms and open market policies in the European Union. What are the lessons from COVID-19? So in the COVID-19 crisis, we saw that digital services, the use of digital services, digital technologies actually made European citizens stronger. Werner Stenck, who is the digital policy expert in Margaret Vestager's cabinet, argued that the only thing that really worked during the height of the crisis, the heat of the crisis, was digital. So in fact, digital business models based on technologies kept Europe open for business. It allowed us to work from home, to secure our deliveries, and so on and so forth. And all of that was based on the energy, ingenuity, and also the reliability of both domestic and foreign companies. And I think these are the lessons that call for a new strategic ambition for European digital policy making, and this is an ambition that puts much less emphasis on independence and prescriptive policies, and more emphasis on openness, because more emphasis of independence and prescriptive policies would render Europeans actually less sovereign. What are the pitfalls? A few concluding remarks. What are potential pitfalls of European technology sovereignty, also based on the versions of sovereignty that we currently read and hear? We argue that, defined in a protectionist way, technology sovereignty would actually reduce Europe's long-term international competitiveness, and it would also reduce Europeans' access to cutting-edge technologies and related business models. It would also contribute to a further reduction of attractiveness to international investments and R&D and research-intensive companies. An isolationist approach to sovereignty would only lead to what we call notional sovereignty. So in reality, the EU would indeed be free to adapt its own standards, but it would not provide the much desired economic and innovation benefits. Such ambitions would actually render Europe obsolete in shaping of international laws and norms that will guide the global digital future. On the contrary, an open and non-discriminatory approach to technology sovereignty would create new opportunities for European companies to compete at the frontier of technological development. It can indeed improve the autonomy of Europe as a whole, and of course, the myriad of firms, small and large. And a cooperative approach would have a positive impact on the EU's long-term global political influence. That calls on European policymakers to aim for closer market integration and closer regulatory cooperation with what we call trustworthy global partners, such as the US, the G7, or the larger group of OECD countries. So these were let's say, the top level conclusions, and then we have a more, let's say, semi-top level recommendations calling for greater openness, reinvigorated efforts to improve human capital with regard to digital skills, and we are calling for unprecedented efforts to strengthen the single market, to actually work towards a real single market. So an autonomy-based approach to technology sovereignty would aim to improve Europeans' ability to understand, access, and use new technologies, including technologies that emerge from the next wave of innovation in ICT. That requires the provision of education, the provision of human capital, and this is important, it also requires unprecedented emphasis of knocking down the regulatory barriers in Europe's incomplete single market, which currently prevent the easy traverse of technologies, the easy traverse of goods and services across borders, and also currently prevent the scale up of promising innovative companies. So I will leave it with that, and looking forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Matthias. And while you stop sharing your screen, all right, very much, very good, thank you. I'm going to hand over the floor to Dita Tarantsova, whom I said initially is Vice President of the European Parliament and also a member of the European Parliament, where she sits in the Liberal Renew Europe group. And where she works on digital internal market issues. Dita, we are very happy that you were able to join us here today. So if you unmute yourself, I'm going to leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you, Matthias, for your introductory presentation. I think it was an excellent idea to organize this webinar on this topic. I think it's really a timely discussion from two points of view. One, and you said it, we've heard a lot from the Commission and other also national leaders on a lot about this, I would say, multifaceted term of the sovereignty, technological sovereignty. And second, of course, is the pandemic and the COVID crisis and the impact it would have on the EU policies in general. Of course, we've heard a lot on our dependency and vulnerability when it comes to the medical medicines and medical equipment, but also it has an impact on the technology, as you mentioned it in your presentation. So I think the question, as you put it here, if we can draw a lesson on this matter already from what has happened during the COVID crisis, I would say absolutely. And I think one of the lessons learned is that the absolute sovereignty is not a helpful, maybe not even a feasible approach for the EU to take, because when it comes both, I would say, to trade issues, digital technologies, because isolating ourselves will do more harm than good to the European Union. The way forward is, and I fully agree with your last slide, was that we need to, I would say, and I'm old-fashioned person in this regard, complete single market. You said we need to have real single market. It's a good terminology maybe to use because some people are getting, fed up with complete single market. So yes, let's go for the real single market where we really need to tear down the barriers that exist nowadays in the internal market. And for me, this is the way forward, how we can create what some people are calling for the European Google, the European, European companies. Second way forward is that we have a rule-based system in the European Union, which all the companies operating in the EU market will respect. And then it doesn't matter whether this company actually come from China, US, or Germany. But we need to really look at how the rules-based system in the EU works. There are, of course, different also ideas how we can approach or achieve this technological sovereignty. Some people call for create, I would say, in an artificial way, the European Google and how to create the European champions. The other way that people also refer to is to have legislation that will actually discriminate against foreign competitors. I would strongly argue against these two approaches, and I will explain why. Uh, you gave also the example from the past, which I think are still relevant nowadays, because we already tried in the past to create, I would say, in an artificial way, the European champions. Look at the French Quero, which was the European French/European attempt to have a search engine coming from Europe. The reality was that it was very costly. It cost French taxpayers hundreds of millions of euros, and there was no result basically achieved. It didn't achieve what was meant to achieve. The reason why it failed is very, very simple. I mean, we are not in China, we are in Europe, and here we have a competitive market where also the consumers decide. So consumers will always choose what is more practical, cost efficient for them. In the past, we had yet another French attempt how to create an artificial big tech giant. It was the IT group Bull from the 80s, which was attempt of French government to have a kind of French IBM in Europe. And again, it cost taxpayers millions of euros, and it failed. So I think this is not really the way forward in Europe to have state-based artificial approaches. But what we need to do is to really focus on innovation and research in Europe. But I would add on to it, let's leave the innovation to the innovators, and let's then the market to figure out who is the champion in the market. The second approach that I said I disagree with is really to create the legislative walls in Europe and basically to discriminate against the foreign companies in the EU market. Again, I mean, we can go to the extreme that we see in China with Alibaba. I don't think this approach will fly in the EU. For many reasons, but I would perhaps make this topic more attractive to the audience. Let's see what is happening with the discussion on the Digital Services Act. Where we have, we don't know yet, of course, how the final proposal will look like, but we are already now discussing the ex-ante regulation in the Digital Services Act. And well, it's crystal clear that what we are going to basically focus on are and we are going to attack are the big, mega big tech giants. Can you think of any European tech giants that will be attacked by this legislation? So, I mean, we will end up in the discussion where the balance is, how rigorous should we be when it comes to the rules that we will put into place in the ex-ante regulation. How far we will go to actually exclude certain companies from the EU market. What will be the consequences? What we should take into account the possibility of the retaliation against the European companies. So at the end of the day, who will suffer and what will be detrimental will be the European market, both the EU companies operating in the market, but also the European consumers that will suffer from this approach. If we see what is happening on the global scale, we see, of course, that some of our competitors are now building more walls. and Europe so far has been has advocated for the policy to tear down the walls, and I think this is the correct approach even nowadays. Speaking about tearing down the walls, let's look what is happening in the single market. I mean, the situation is far from being the best one. What was interesting for me to read in your paper or in your study was the shocking statistics comparing the SMEs in Europe and in the US. We always claim that the SMEs are the backbone of the European market, but as it has been proved in your study, there are a far greater number of SMEs in the US than in Europe. And American SMEs have more also employees than the European ones. So of course, then for the American companies, it's much easier to scale up than for the European ones. And if we look what is happening in the European market, it's crystal clear that the SMEs trade far less cross-border than the larger companies. So as you also pointed out in your study, the single market basically currently disproportionate between the large and the small companies, and the larger companies benefit more than the small ones. So if we really want to have the European companies to be more competitive globally, we need to create a level playing field for them, first of all, in Europe, so they can really benefit from the innovation and have the chances to scale up in Europe. When we see what is happening at a global kind of cooperation at a global level, again, the COVID crisis, what has shown clearly is that we can't be 100% self-sufficient in the world of today. You said it very correctly that no single economy can set the global standards alone, and I very much agree with it. I think this is one of the arguments, but the other argument, which was also cleared from this pandemic, was that we have to also look at the dependency, that over-dependency is very dangerous. The way forward for me is to keep openness, connectivity, and also cooperation. If you look what happened in the trade policy, for instance, when India stopped the export of rice, and we saw all the European exporters quickly shifting to other supply chains from Vietnam, from Pakistan. So this is actually what we have to, I think, look at, and where we need to perhaps have some additional work at the European level to see what is happening with the diversification of our supply chains, and thus to see how to avoid the over-dependency in the future. I'm looking at my notes. One question that you also said, and I agree, but I would like to add something to it. You said that actually the technology has helped Europe to stay open for business during the pandemic. Yes, but look where this technology comes from. We are speaking about Zoom that we are using even today. We are speaking about Microsoft Teams for conference calls. We are speaking about Netflix for entertainment. So yet again, if we were closed in our European walls and we wouldn't have had this access to these technologies, so the crisis would have been much worse for us. So I think that the way forward, definitely, or the answer is not that we create a fortress Europe, but instead we try to have everybody to play by the same rules in the EU market. I would perhaps stop here and add maybe one last remark. I only hope that this whole discussion about technology sovereignty will not end up in creating Europe, which is more protectionist than it's today. I think some people, when they speak about sovereignty, technology sovereignty, they refer to really protectionist policies. And I think we have to be really cautious in the days to come to keep Europe still open and to resist this protectionist tendencies in Europe. Thank you, and happy to engage with the questions.
Thank you so much, Dita. Very, very, very good. You had said many important things there that I'd like to return to later. Let me now give the floor to Axel Voss. Axel, you hadn't joined us when I made the introduction of you, so let me make that once again, which is that Axel is a member of the European Parliament, where he sits in the Committee on Legal Affairs for the European People's Party. Axel is also a very strong voice on digital policies and matters in the Parliament, so it's a great honor for us that you have joined us for this afternoon webinar, Axel. If you unmute yourself, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thanks a lot, Frederick, and thanks also for the invitation, and thanks to Matthias for the presentation, and my best regards to Dita. Also, good to see you in this way. So digital sovereignty, of course, has a lot of issues around, but let me also state some things. Europe is in a kind of a sandwich position between China and the US. We can choose so far between big data or Big Brother. And so that's why we need to come forward with our own approach, a European approach. And this is what we are typically saying, oh, this is value orientated. But if we are looking to the development so far, I would say we are too complicated. We are acting much too complicated in our world of politics and coming forward. Of course, the other regions in the world, like US or China, have more than less one mentality. They have more than less one legal structure. They have more than less one tradition. And we are already fragmented when we are starting. So at the end, we have to be careful that we are not fragmenting our digital single market at the end too fast. So if I'm looking back to the last term, we came up with directives in copyright, in digital content, and so for the contractual situation, and also audiovisual media directive. So we are having one goal, but everyone is doing it on its own. So we might have 27 different approaches. And this is not what I would consider as a kind of a real digital single market. That's why we should have in mind that in the future, we should come up only with regulation. So otherwise, I can't see how we will come forward. But this creates already a kind of a problem with our member states. I would say if we have to touch, and what we are doing is also trying to find a regulatory environment for the civil liability of artificial intelligence. But here the confrontation is already there. Our colleagues in our member states will say, oh, civil liability, this is something to do with our civil law, this is our competence. Please, EU, stay out of this field of legislation. And this is the wrong approach. And we are seeing a lot of these difficulties from the member states. And this is one big problem we have to change, or they have to change the mindset in a way that we need now, if we would like to come to an eye level with China or the US, we need to be efficient, and efficient means a real digital single market, and also in these areas or environments where member states might have the competences in it. So that's why I would like to see these a little bit more radical pushed forward in a way. Of course, if we are coming to digital sovereignty, even the headline for me is much too passive. So this shouldn't be a criticism at all. I have this in my manifesto also, because digital sovereignty will be understood by colleagues, and this is something what we all want to have. But at the end, to have data protection, to have digital sovereignty means I would like to come to a level what we should already have. And this is nothing what would or give the European a kind of a leading position. So at the end, we need to have more, and we need to be more active on this. And therefore, and Dieter is totally right. So far, we don't have a significant European search engine or a browser or social media or messaging services. And also here, these video conferences platforms. Therefore, I don't think we should think in all of these again and again that the Europeans should lead in these fields. No, we should probably more come up with some priorities where we should go for. This might be a green tech, smart farming, industrial data, quantum computing, whatever it is. But I think we need to go beyond this wish to have a kind of a digital sovereignty. That's why we need these priorities for coming forward and the strong political will in coming to these points. And this means also investment and a lot of billion of euros at the end also for investing this. Therefore, I would like also to see a chance. Matthias said, oh yes, we don't have the capacity or the possibility to set standards worldwide in a way. But we should try, and we should also try. I would see that there might be a possibility if we are linking each other with the transatlantic situation. So if the US and the EU is forming some standards, it might be something what nobody can ignore at the end. But we need here also the strong will in coming forward in setting these standards. And if we are looking to the development, the digital developments during the COVID-19 crisis, I would say in Europe, this is so far a kind of an evidence of incapacity. We have seen the stereotype behavior in our member states that they are thinking just to their borders, they are closing the borders, to develop something in digital like the tracing app or the digital certification of immunity or whatever it is. Everyone is doing now its own in a way. Probably not all of these now developed tracing apps in Europe might be able to talk to the other apps and so on. And this is a lack of political leadership at the end. We have to do here more. Probably, yes, of course, COVID might be a kind of a shock and everyone has to react in the first place. But at least we should come forward at the European level and in the European community in a way. If I'm looking also back, just to give you an idea, the discussion about the tracing app and for me, a kind of a third level position, if this is decentralized or centralized, gives you a kind of a impression that we are not coming forward if we are only sticking to the situation and would like to have a 150% solution for data protection, but not balancing the efficiency in fighting the virus again. So we have now chosen the most inefficient app at the end and not level these a little or balance these a little bit better. So this gives me sometimes the idea the Europeans are thinking we would like to win the digitalization, but without data. If we are not able and not willing to give data at the end, we will also not win the race of the artificial intelligence issues. If we are not training our algorithms like other regions in the world are doing this, we are more than less out in a way. And this is also very problematic if we would like to see us in a kind of a leading position. Dieter mentioned also the Digital Services Act. We know we can't go on like this, what was regulated since the 2000 or 2001, when the first e-commerce directive came out. So we have to fight some issues, what have developed, if this is fake news, propaganda, criminal issues, etc. So therefore we have to balance also the responsibilities of platforms a little bit better. But if you're looking to my experience to the copyright directive, the communication will head into the same direction what we have had already. One of the political groups or some of the political groups will only discuss about upload filters, etc., etc., and not understanding probably the idea or the need to balance for other issues, especially when it's now starting to destabilize democratic states or democratic rules and behaviors, etc., etc. And therefore, I think we need to balance these. And so far, what I have learned from this copyright discussion, fact-based discussion probably won't happen, because we are coming again and again to this point, they will need some technical issues to get rid of some content of the platform, and that's why this is upload filter and their freedom of speech and so on and so on. Instead of having a real fact-based discussion on it and not ideologically funded in a way. So, of course, then we need also to come forward, we have to understand that Europe, from my point of view, not only has to have in mind, if we're coming to the idea of a cryptocurrency, for instance, that we don't need a cryptocurrency for financial policy reasons or currency reasons or whatever, but we need to have a kind of a cryptocurrency, from my point of view, because of competition reasons. If a big American company is starting with a kind of a global cryptocurrency, and we are just sitting there and watching how this will be developed, then we are sitting there like what we are doing with a big search engine in place. And then, of course, another step would be also to regulate monopolies, where they are disturbing the market in a way. We have to be open for emerging companies. We have to be open for getting a different view on the national cartel laws and antitrust laws, and we have to change these a little bit. But in the end, nothing will happen probably if we are not coming forward on our political leaders if they are still thinking in a way what they are always doing and say, oh, I'm dealing my national interest on a European level, instead of approaching these differences and saying, if we would like to come forward and being on eye level with China and the Americans, we need to have an European interest at the beginning to be more efficient and to come to this eye level. And then the member states might contribute. But if we are not achieving the situation that we are acting as one in Europe, then I can't see really a chance in getting this eye-level dimension. I'm not sure if I'm talking already too much, but of course the digitalization and this sovereignty needs a lot more. So we are seeing the discussion around Huawei and should we integrate them in this 5G network, etc. So far, even there is no European counterpart in a way, and so far immediately. Yes, we can do this if we pay a little bit more, if it will last longer, and so on. But this is one point we have to make up our mind if we would like to integrate. Just a kind of an example how dependent we are already. And therefore we have to ask ourselves, do we really would like to be a data colony of the US or China? And if we don't want to be a colony, then we have to change ourselves in a radical way, coming up with radical new ideas in balancing issues if we would like to regulate some of these problems, and being more creative also as a legislator, and also coming up with new procedural issues also as a legislator. So we need to be more flexible, not just regulating today for something and then saying, oh, in 5 years we will evaluate and blah, blah, blah. No, I think we should be more getting a better flexibility in observing the development and the market and acting when it's necessary, and not setting deadlines and so on. And therefore we need probably a different structure. We haven't achieved these. If we are looking to the European Parliament also, we are fighting each other from committee to committee who is competent for artificial intelligence, and this takes a lot of weeks and or months to solve. And also the idea, the first consultation, and now if we are looking to the Commission a data strategy, AI strategy, etc., they will have a kind of a feedback deadline in mid of June. Yes, everything is helpful with good new ideas, but it lasts. It lasts long, because then the Parliament is finding its own position, and then this will be mixed in a way and coming then to this legislative procedure, and then we will have the same discussion again. And probably there are some aspects we might probably simplifying and coming faster forward, because from my own impression and approach, it is necessary that we are concentrating and being faster and director, setting priorities, giving a lot of money and investors. We should come with skills of our citizens to educate these better, etc. But we need to come forward, and we need probably to have a kind of a more radical approach or different approach, and not doing everything again and again in the same way how we are doing this now.
All right, thank you very much, Axel. Very useful. A lot of viewpoints in there that I'm sure that we are going to return to. I am receiving lots of questions through the chat function here, and I'm going to bring those up. Let me also remind you that you are also welcome to ask your question or make your comment yourself. So you use the raise your hand function, and I will then make sure that you get an opportunity to get in. Let me start off with the first question, or at least a couple of questions actually, that perhaps drawing on the point of the difference between big data and Big Brother, and what Europe's role in the future is going to be here. There was one who made the point here that if we look back, for instance, at mobile phone communication equipment, we've had a couple of strong European firms who, through competition, also enabled to create a big role for Europe in setting standards in global markets and making sure sort of that also global rules reflected the type of patterns of competition, innovation, and respect for values and rules that we would like to see. So the question here becomes one. So when Europe now looks towards the future and wants to carve out a role for itself, to what extent can that be done through regulation, and to what extent does it also need to be backed up by European firms that are globally competitive, globally successful, and can basically make the case for why the rest of the world should listen to Europe? So that was the question. Do we need, can we really take a regulatory approach to this issue? Do we also need to have commercial success in order to build up a role for Europe? Dita, do you want to come in on that question?
Okay. Yes, indeed. I think that, well, I'm a liberal, so my approach to it is always the same. I want to give the market the floor first. I want the market to figure it out. And if there is a real problem in the market, then we have to intervene, but not the other way around. So if we come back, for instance, to the discussion on the Digital Services Act, so clearly what I see, the e-commerce directive that have served its purpose, and there are really good, stable pillars of this e-commerce directive, then in my point of view, should stay also in the future. So I'm not the one calling for an EU regulation, legislation on every single approach. I come from the Czech Republic, where we managed to have the Czech kind of Google, which is called Seznam, and they share the market with the Google. And it was not a state intervention that made Seznam to win the market. It was just the company that managed to attract the consumers, and it was really driven by the market. So I think we have to be very cautious when it comes to legislate, especially the digital environment, which is very fast-moving environment. And my approach has been always to really fix only the biggest loopholes. And also what I'm trying to do now is to see whether everything which we have in the current legislation is actually fit for the purpose. Because of course we created a legislation where the internet was almost inexistable. So we need to see how we can really, and I said it in my introductory remarks, tear down the barriers. For me, it's not to create more legislation, but it's really to see how to help the companies.
Thank you, Dita. Matthias, do you want to come in here? I mean, you made the point in your presentation that that we are risking what you call notional sovereignty, which is that we may have sovereignty, but in practical terms, that may not be the case because we don't have sort of the commercial power to shape the influence of global rules anyway. So thinking sort of ahead about sort of how do you see this issue being developed in the future, where we on the one hand can see continued growth in European digital dynamism in the creation of new firms, and how that link up with efforts by European authorities, mostly European Commission, European Union, to also introduce regulations. In what fields are we talking about where sort of that marriage between commercial success and regulatory approaches could work?
Yeah, when we talk about sovereignty and also notional and de facto sovereignty, there are certainly different voices that are popping up in my mind. First of all, I think that the European Commission was a bit misguided when 5 years ago they decided to launch the Digital Single Market Initiative. I think the real regulatory barriers that prevent digital business models or non-digital businesses to scale up and compete across national borders in the EU are legislative barriers. Regulatory barriers that are different in one member state. If you cross the border, and if you cross another border, you are exposed to an entirely different set of regulations, and these regulations are to some extent sector specific. You find them in logistics and transport services, but in many ways they are horizontal: consumer protection, taxation, not only VAT but also corporate taxation. And I think these are the major barriers beyond language, obviously, that prevent European businesses to scale across borders. So the basic question, the basic answer to the question whether Europe needs more or less regulation is that we need more regulations rather than directive, as Axel Voss pointed out. At the same time, we need deregulation. There are a few studies that point to a very strong growth and investment effect if you reduce the level of regulatory restrictiveness in some sectors or horizontal areas to the most liberal EU member state, the level of the most liberal EU member state. And I think this is a promising approach to regulation at the EU level in the future. At the same time, I'm a bit concerned about a larger problem, a structural impediment in European economic integration that we face when we talk about European technology sovereignty, or that is being revealed to us when we talk about technology sovereignty. And I think this challenge is about the incapacity of EU policymakers to really change the European Union's regime of economic integration for the better, to improve the single market, to achieve real material improvements in the single market. And the whole debate about digital sovereignty or technology sovereignty is distracting political attention and also political capital away from the need to tear down regulatory barriers in certain industries and also in horizontal areas like consumer protection and taxation, for example.
All right, thank you very much. Axel, there is also a question here which connects with something that you were saying, and the question is basically this. So the race for success in fields like search engines, etc., that's already over. And wouldn't it be better if Europe specialized in areas where there isn't already a crowded market by large and big firms coming from United States or from other parts of the world? So, for instance, looking at 3D printing or different forms of AI in the future, isn't that where we can see more applications that are of interest to the Europe from, given its current industrial structure, and where we also can do much more on the regulatory side in order to help a development where European firms are going to take global leadership there?
So I totally agree. It doesn't make sense if we are just trying to catch up with everything what is already achieved by others. We need, and that's why I talked about prioritizing, that we need to come forward. It might be 3D printing or whatever it is, but I think we need this prioritizing at the end in coming forward and being also a kind of a leader in some of these developments. This is possible if we have this strong political will and also the investment and the legal framing around. And I would say this is probably the best way in coming forward. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate also a monopoly like the search engine, what we have already in Europe. I think it's not necessary in just saying to them, oh, you are not playing very well, and so give us some fines. No, I think we need to regulate also if there is a monopoly and a kind of a not functional market any longer, then we need to have a kind of a regulatory framework also for these to come back to a situation where the market is better functioning.
And would you also say, Axel, connecting with another question, that there is an opportunity here for the EU to use the transatlantic alliance to go for much more sort of global standards that reflects the type of viewpoints that tend to be strong in Europe? And if there is such an opportunity, where in what areas within the digital field do you think that could be used?
At first, I would say the transatlantic cooperation in questioning these global standards or whatever might be a way forward. But this shouldn't exclude at the end all others, but who might be interested in negotiating standards and implementing these on eye level, then this is a way forward. And also this might also include that we are adapting some American ideas or whatever it is, but it needs to have a kind of an eye-level situation and not a kind of a top-down situation. And that's why we then might also come forward in different developments. As long as we have monopolies in this area and they are dictating more than less the technical standards or other things, like what we have seen in this Tracing Act question, so where the market is led by two companies, and so then all of a sudden they are saying, no, I'm not opening my API for applications what you have in mind, and this is something what we can't agree on. If we have to find in a situation like this to fight a virus, then we need also the cooperation and not. So it seems that all of a sudden these both big companies are the protectors of data. And so on, and this can't be at the end be the outcome and the result of a situation and pandemic situation like this. So just taking these as an example. So therefore we need to regain the capacity as a legislator, what we would like to have, and everyone who is not agreeing on this can leave our market. So they have the freedom to choose, but we are the one who are saying what is necessary and what not, especially in such a situation, and therefore we need the cooperation. And if this is not happening, and I'm a little bit upset about this situation, what these both big companies have played the role there. That's why we need to make this clear after the pandemic situation, probably what might happen and what not. And that's why we need also this regulatory approach on monopolies. But of course, once again, to come forward, we should also focus on developments where we might have a chance to develop ourselves to a kind of a leading position.
Okay, thank you very much. Dita, there is also a specific question to you here, but I'm also going to preface it because some of the attendees have a discussion here about the difference between a small company and a large company. And there is the viewpoint that when Europe sets its policies, whether that's going to be a regulation or a directive, it's usually something that is fine for large companies because they have the size and the resources in order to adjust to it. But that's not a luxury that many small companies will have. The broader question is, what can we do in order to make sure that also startup firms, smaller companies can have a chance to create something, and that we don't just get rules that are adjusted to sort of the reality for big tech and for large companies?
I said it already during my first introductory remarks. For me, the SMEs are really the backbone of the EU, and it's not a cliche. We see it, and especially in the digital field, where I would say small company can scale up and become big company very soon. We need to really, to take into account their specificities when drafting the legislation. And we had this discussion over the copyright reform. We will have the same discussion even now during the Digital Services Act. We already had a quite interesting discussion in the Parliament on this issue, because of course some of the proposition, even they look really nice from the outset. At the end of the day, what they will do is that the large big companies will quickly adjust to the legislation, and we will kill the small ones, and that we have to avoid. I really hope that also this pandemic will trigger a new discussion on the role of SMEs in Europe in general, not only when it comes to the digital, which we are discussing today, but also in general terms. And I think really we need to get back to the policy where the SMEs was always the first focus of every legislation. So I would agree with those arguments that were mentioned in the chat, that SMEs sometimes really suffer, and that we need to pay special attention to them.
And also to follow up with another question to you, Dita, before going to Matthias, there is a question here which is on the broader discussion that we're having right now in Europe about, on the one hand, a debate around whether we're going to relax some of the competition rules in order to create European champions, or to allow mergers to go through that will concentrate markets. On the other hand, we have a debate about whether we're going to restrict the size and the market influence of big tech. Do you think there is a contradiction between those different views, or is there not?
Well, definitely sometimes these two ideas are getting mixed up in one package, which I think is not a good approach. We have to definitely look at our competition policy, which will be a part of our overall discussion on our digital future. But I think one of the shortcomings that we have experienced in the past when it comes to competition policy cannot be dealt with within the legislation like Digital Services Act. So I really want to make a distinction between what we do in the competition policy and what we do in the legislative framework as such. For me, the legislative framework is about to have a rule-based system in the EU that will be respected and implemented by all companies operating in the EU market. And the competition policy is there to really enforce it and make sure it is implemented. So in a way, they are linked together, but definitely we should not mix up the discussion that some of the lessons learned from the competition policy will be addressed in the pieces of legislation like Digital Services Act.
All right, thank you very much. Matthias, I'm going to read up a quote from a question here, which goes like this. EU is allowing foreign platforms to use European users' financial services data real-time several times a day to enter digital payments market, crypto and/or instant payments. But no European bank can access user data from other sectors of platforms real-time several times a day. The Commission data draft strategy doesn't address this so far. So in the paper, you are making the case that the financial services sector and how it links up with digitalization is a pretty good case for how the EU can become sort of autonomous in the sense that it's open and non-discriminatory towards the rest of the world. And at the same time, it promotes a lot of European innovation with new startups that have grown pretty big and can also compete with global firms. Do you think there is there's a case here to learn more from how we have kept digital openness in the payments area, and that those lessons can be translated into other areas?
Yeah, I think there's a strong case. I mean, I can still reiterate that the problem why we don't see the big tech giants, the tech champions coming from a European Union member state is that it is close to impossible for a digital startup to scale across national borders in the EU if they are operating in a business that is heavily regulated. Think of taxi market services, a sector that is not only regulated at the federal level in the EU, but also at sub-federal and also municipality level, which is why it is close to impossible for a startup from, let's say, Estonia to roll out a business model to Madrid in Spain. And the same is very obviously true for a financial services provider. Asset management providers, payment services providers, they all have to stick to EU regulations and a whole bunch of national regulations attached to it. In many cases, these regulations are directive. That means that we have one EU directive in place and 28, now 27 additional regulations on top of it. So that's, of course, a huge burden for pretty much every company, particularly small companies. At the same time, a regulation is always a subsidy to big business. So there are still many large European banks, of which some are very, still very successful at the global level, who benefit from this regulatory patchwork. At the same time, you have alternative payments services providers and also companies that are now operating in, for example, robots or AI-based asset management that start to compete, and their business models are not dependent on or not subject to that huge amount of regulations that you have to comply with if you are a plain vanilla financial services provider or a bank. So now there's two options. Either regulators go ahead with aligning the regulatory level playing field. That would either be introducing new regulations for fintech companies who successfully offer alternative payment and asset management solutions, or to get rid of the regulatory burden that holds back traditional European incumbent banks or incumbent financial services providers from entering these markets. And I think the way to go is the second way, to first of all, reduce the level of regulations and to reduce regulatory fragmentation to approach a real EU financial services regulatory framework. But this is, of course, very difficult to achieve. There are so many national bank and financial market supervisory authorities who still want to have a say in the future. And I doubt that this is a niche or an area where we are going to see material success and improvements in the future. But that leads me to my final comment, and perhaps I didn't make this clear before. I think this whole debate about technology sovereignty is actually about a more systemic issue, and that is the future of European economic integration. And I think the right way to go ahead with European economic integration is a system of European Union economic integration a la carte. So those who want to do more, as Jean-Claude Juncker and his commission pointed out in the white paper of, I think, 2007, 2018, those who want to do more should go ahead and do more. Those who want to have a common regulation for fintech, a common regulation for traditional financial service providers, or a common regulation on AI licensing, go ahead and leave it open to others who want to join. If you want to go ahead with Eurobonds, you may want to go ahead with like-minded governments. It should be open to others that want to join, even though with redistributional issues, it's a bit more difficult, obviously. Yeah, but this is something that I consider very important. And this is not only an EU issue, it's also an issue of the WTO, which is in a crisis. And both the EU and the WTO should be more open to alternative modes of economic integration and regulation.
All right, thank you. We are getting very close to the end, and we're going to ask a final question to each participant, starting with you, Axel. This is a comment from the audience or a listener who says, we agree that to keep building the single market, regulations are preferable over directives. How will this be done when we tackle issues like what is illegal speech, where it's unlikely that member states will find a common denominator? For startups, the country of origin principle is a fundamental component of the e-commerce directive that can be strengthened, although some member states are undermining it, referring to the German regulation. So is there, I think sort of the essence of the question is there really a possibility here to create more of a regulatory approach that will unify the European market? Over to you, Axel.
I'm convinced that we have to use also for the solution of some of these problems more technology approaches. And so if we're coming to these platform question, more responsibility, anonymity, and clear names and so on, this might be done also via some techniques, and so that nobody has to fear to give up its anonymity in the net and so on. So we have solutions and there are a lot of ideas, but if we are as a legislator not open enough also to use these, then it might be very difficult. But I'm still convinced there are ways to balance everything in a better way. But we have to be open and to be more radical and different like before.
Thank you very much, Axel. Dita, there is a question here about Europe's capacity in AI, 5G, and many other areas, both when it comes to generating global successful firms and to be able to participate in global standard setting. And the common thread seems to be here that Europe also lacks human capital and capacity in research and development, that we are not spending as much as China, United States, and possibly other countries on these areas. What do you see as the way forward here for Europe to also become leaders in the R&D in these fields?
Well, I have to agree with the comment that here we really need to accelerate our activity and do more. I hope there will be perhaps some positive, outcome also out of the discussion on the next European budget in this regard, because when we speak now about all this impact of the pandemic on our economy, we tend to look for an ad hoc solution. But the long-term solution here is really to spend more in research and development and to see how we can also boost the skills in Europe. So I could only agree with the argument made. As for what you have started at the beginning, where you see where we can perhaps set up the standards globally, I think we had one good example with the GDPR, and I think, and as I see the discussion going on the artificial intelligence, can be yet another argument where the ethical approach of the European Union can be the one which will set up the standards for other players.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, over to you, Matthias. There are some competing viewpoints in the audience here about the concept of technology sovereignty. On the one hand, there is the argument that the risk is if we go down the route of trying to define technology sovereignty, we're going to go for a narrow definition, which is going to reduce our openness and reduce the capacity for competitive European firms to participate in the global economy, to have open supply and value chains. On the other hand, there is the viewpoint that technology sovereignty may not lead really anywhere, and that regulation may not sort of be a potent instrument for Europe to exercise any influence on the global stage in the future, and that the only way to do so would be to go for more autarkic kind of solutions. Would it be possible to do that, to basically have an autarkic system in Europe, basically a system of self-sufficiency, or would that radically deprive the European economy from opportunities to grow?
That's an interesting question, of course, a bit difficult to answer because we cannot see into the future. But I think history tells us two things. First of all, those countries that were governed by governments and political regimes that were seeking for autarky failed in many respects in economic and social development, and also with respect to political development. And they did not create in any way open societies that prospered, or that we would now in modern terms call sustainable, develop in a sustainable way. To put it with the words of Wilhelm Röpke, a famous post-war German economist, he argued that internationalism, like charity, starts at home. So I think that the EU and member state governments should embrace openness for their own citizens and own companies in the first place, before seeking protectionist and rather isolationist measures. At the same time, and this is, I think, the second bigger picture that we can see when we look at history, the larger your market is, the more people your country hosts, the greater the probability that one of your businesses is going to become an internationally successful company. So this is the law of the large number. If you think of it in that way, then this calls for tearing down regulations within the EU, so that you can at least build to some extent of the mass of businesses and the number of your population. But even if that comes together with isolationist policies that shield certain sectors, that shield certain policy areas where you have a lot of regulatory capture, this is not going to help you to sustain and have competitive companies in the future.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists, Axel Voss, Dita Charantsova, and Matthias Bauer. I think it's been a very good and solid discussion that we have had this afternoon, and I hope that people that have been in the audience also think so. There are lots of questions that we didn't have a chance to ask during this seminar, but I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities in the future to return to the issue of technology sovereignty, because I think this is going to remain on the agenda for quite some time. So thank you so much to each and everyone that joined in, and a special thanks to Dita and Axel that very kindly took 90 minutes this afternoon to join us for this seminar. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Dita. Bye.
Ciao, Axel.